Hello, everyone. My name is Thelmy Lutinatambua. I'm the Senior Communications Strategist at the Solutions Project. So excited for people to watch today. This is going to be a conversation about climate solutions, journalism, and a lot of the other narrative trends that we're seeing in the climate solutions space. We're going to be joined by the amazing journalist and writer, Yesenia Funes. We're just going to wait for her to hop on a bit, and thank you so much. If you haven't seen it already, I encourage you to go to the Solutions Project website, thesolutionsproject.org, and you'll find there our Climate Solutions Narrative Trends Report. If you want to take a look at it, it's got a lot of good stuff in there. But yeah, Yesenia and I will be digging into all of that, but also a lot of the other things that we're seeing in the climate journalism space. Hello.
Doing well. This is my first Instagram
Good,
Live.
good. How are you doing? Really? Well, I
Thank
think you
you. I
wore
appreciate
the
that.
exact right glasses for it. Well, I was just telling everyone who's watching so far about what we're going to be chatting about the world of climate solutions journalism and some of the narrative trends that we're seeing. And I give you a quick intro
Of
of
course, yeah.
myself.
So,
I was
hey
wondering if you could
everybody, my name
introduce
is
yourself to
Yesenia
everyone
Funes.
watching.
I am an independent environmental journalist, currently serving as editor at large for Atmos magazine, but you can find my work in Vogue, Cosmopolitan, The Guardian, and many, many more. I'm excited to talk about climate solutions journalism and this amazing report that you all just put out.
Yes, I've been a fan of yours for a long time. I'll be honest. I've been following you on Twitter and reading so much of your reporting, and your stories just have so much complexity and nuance and humanity to them, which is like a big reason why I wanted to have you on today to chat about this. We've been seeing a lot of things shifting in the climate solution space, and especially in how people are talking about it, but there's still so far to go. But yes, Cindy and I are just going to be having a conversation. And again, if you want to drop in any comments or questions, go for it in the chat. But yeah, we'll kick
Yeah,
off.
really
Yesenia, do you
excited to
want to
just,
start us
I
off
guess,
with
dive into
a
some of
first
what this
question?
report found, which I was really struck by. Part of what you all highlight is that after 2020, more media outlets were covering environmental issues through this equity lens, right? But this year we saw a slight dip. Curious, Thelma, how can we ensure this coverage is more than just a trend, but actually a key tenet of climate and environmental coverage moving forward?
We've started doing this report in 2017 and 2018. And when we started, it was like around 3 to 6% of all coverage of climate energy solutions talked about race and equity and justice. And it was really shocking. It was like so low. And then we saw it really increase. And especially when the Black Lives Matter movement really took off, then the following year in the report, we saw this big increase where it was like over 30% of articles that talked about renewable energy, that talked about climate solutions, then had this important lens of really thinking about how does this apply to equity and justice. And it was awesome. It was like things were really taking off. We are seeing that maybe more journalists were realizing that they need to have this frame in their stories. But then this year we had a little bit more of a dip. Now, we don't know if this is going to be a long-term trend. We'll have to see next year's report if it's, going to keep on going down. Was the 2021 report just like really high because so many people were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and lots of other orgs,
Yeah,
especially climate
yeah.
orgs, were kind of having a racial justice reckoning moment then. So we don't know if it's like a trend or not yet, but because it dipped this year, we're like, that is interesting. And so I think there's a couple things that are really important. Pew Research recently did a study on the diversity of different like beats and the environment and energy beat. They found that 84% of journalists in those covered
Yeah.
beats were white, which was huge. That's shocking to me. And it's like one thing that says to me is that we need a diversity of storytellers. Whether you're a journalist or you're an Instagram influencer or whatever it is, we need a diversity of voices telling these climate stories. And I think if we have that diversity of storytellers sharing their own truths, then we're going to get much better coverage because we're going to have that people are going to have their own intersectional stories built in. Um, Solutions Project also released a report a couple years ago called Covering Climate Equitably, which is actually a guide for journalists if they want to learn about how to cover issues with more equity. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested for you because you're a journalist. When you are approaching a story, like
Yeah, and I
how
just
do
want
you
to mention
start?
before
How
I
do you
move
think
on from
about the
that Pew
frames that are
Research
important to
study,
tell?
not only was the number of, journalists of color low among environment and energy, the beat, but also that was like the highest portion of whiteness in a beat. Like that was the least diverse beat among all the beats. So I think it's worth just flagging that and being really explicit that covering environment and energy is like the
Yeah.
whitest beat there is out there. And so, given that context, for me, when I approach storytelling, I really look at the stories that are happening in the news, the stories that are shared with me from my trusted sources, the stories that I'm seeing on the ground through my own lived experience, through the lens of how does this make me feel as a Latina, as the child of immigrants, as a queer person, as someone who grew up in poverty, trying to like look at the reality of what's happening in the news landscape through this lens. And I think that's part of what my readers experience when they read my stories, because when you're looking at the news, which can feel, you know, quite disconnected sometimes from our day to day, and we as journalists are trained to really look at the news as something not happening to us, but something that we're supposed to sort of share with the world. And so I think that what my readers experience when they read my stories is that emotional connection, because it's important to me to sort of grapple with, how is this making me feel? Like I ask myself these questions: what's upsetting me today? What's inspiring me today? What's causing me anxiety today? Really letting my emotions sort of guide what are the stories that I want to tell, who are the voices that I want to hear from, and how can I, report and write this story in a way that does them justice and makes room for readers to sort of experience these feelings with me, which again, like it's not really what I think journalists are trained to do, but I find that the most powerful stories that I read are the ones that trigger my emotions, the ones that take me on like an emotional roller coaster, whether that's, like the story of migrants crossing an ocean and their loved ones who are left looking for them, or stories that look at climate disasters through the lens of specific families and the ways that they've been impacted, and the heartbreak, but also the resilience that many folks build out of these disasters. And so that's a big part of my storytelling method. And it sometimes lands, sometimes it doesn't, but it feels authentic and important to me, so that my work can feel fulfilling, which I think ultimately results in a more rich reading experience for folks.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because relationships are really key to this work. We have to think about our relationships with people and with ourselves, and when we take humanity out of the equation, then it's a lot harder. One quick fact that we found in some other reports is that in a lot of, a couple of years ago, when we looked at coverage of renewable energy,
Yeah.
a lot of the stories didn't even quote a person. Like there was no person even quoted in the whole story. And so we've seen a rise in that in the number of actual human beings quoted in stories, but it's still not 100%. I can't remember the fact off the top of my head, but it's still only, I think, around 75% of renewable energy stories actually quote a person. So the fact that you're
Yeah,
leading with your
and
humanity,
the
leading with
little
relationships, that's
fact
so
that you're
important.
sharing here, right, about like energy and renewables, which is such a big focus of the report that you all do every year, I was really fascinated by the finding around electric vehicles, right? Like how much more coverage is being dedicated to electric vehicles, which transportation is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions here in the US. It's one of the sectors that is most urgent for our policymakers to take on and decarbonize. I was really struck by the fact that EVs in particular have gotten a lot more coverage, but we're not seeing the same level of attention on public transit, which is a form of transportation that is largely used by low-income people, people of color, immigrant folks. And so, why isn't this the case with public transit? Why are we seeing more stories looking at this mode of transportation? And how can reporters like myself do better to cover this key climate solution? Because I do want to recognize that I am one of those reporters who also is not covering public transit in the way that I wish I was.
Yeah, this finding was really interesting to me when our research team at Conspire for Good, and I got to give them a shout out because they were the ones who did this research. When they brought it forward, it was so fascinating because it was like when we looked at, again, articles that are talking about clean energy and climate solutions, 10% of them talked about EVs, electric vehicles. And then I asked them, I was like, well, how many
Wow.
talked about public transportation? And there was only 2% talked about public transportation. And I think part of it comes back to this like American fascination with individualization. Like the power of the individual to have their car is such an ingrained part of the American mentality. And that's something that we actually have to disrupt in our climate solution spaces to make our solutions more community focused. And I think it's so important also for journalists who are covering stories to familiarize
Mm,
ourselves with the history of energy or climate in that space. Like if you look at California, there is a direct history of trying to shut down public transportation, trying to
mm.
make sure that trains do not exist, trying to make it a car state. And so also familiarize with, who is being left out of a story. If you're doing a story on cars, well, how many people in the state do not have access to a car? How many people rely on public transportation? And so always thinking about, what's the history that you're covering here, and then like who's being left out of this solution, who's not getting access to this solution. And I think that will help us not just cover the things that are shiny and
Yeah,
exciting, but that
I
could actually
love
lead
oh,
to
sorry.
more equitable
I
change.
love the point around
So,
history because I think there's
oh
such
no,
a
go
rich
ahead.
history similar to when we talk about redlining, for instance, right around where highways were placed and how they've cut through communities and disconnected communities' access to food and resources and healthcare. And similarly, like the way that certain towns, like I grew up on Long Island, right, which is like a super segregated part of New York. The really wealthy, white towns have sometimes like 3 train stations in one town. Meanwhile, the low income Black and Brown communities are lucky if they even have one. So I'm really, really struck by that history there and think that there's so many stories that that I don't know, so many stories that I haven't read, so many stories waiting to be told to explore some of the history around public transit, who has access to it, how it was built, highways, how they were built, who's facing pollution from that, and tying it to like present day health outcomes or present day access to jobs and economic development. That really resonates with me. And as an environmental justice reporter, I think history is sometimes the most interesting storytelling method too, that can also feel really original and fresh for readers and for editors. History, I think, is like a big foundation for strong climate solutions journalism.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're seeing this really interesting, again, we're seeing these trends happening in the climate solutions journalism space. I'm seeing more newsrooms actually having a
Yeah.
climate solutions reporter, which is huge because we didn't see that in the previous years. Um, for you as a journalist, how would you like to see things go in the future?
Yeah, I think this
How would you
is
like to see
a
the field
point that
change
many
and
of my
grow?
colleagues have made in the past. And so it's not a point original to me, but really wanting to see climate evolve as not just a beat, but like a key part of everyone's beat. And, you know, Justin Worland at time likes to say climate is everything. And I think that's just such an important point that we need to be talking about. Reporters need to be covering climate change into their respective beats, whether they're a politics reporter, whether they're a local courts reporter, you know, whether they're business reporter. There's so many stories here around climate, and we all need to be looking at what those stories are within our respective beats. More so than that, I think that there's also a need to do more, how do I word this, like people first storytelling, and storytelling that is not just extractive and exploiting communities to get that really punchy quotes, stories that are going deeper than what we have historically seen. You know, we talk a lot in journalism about, or rather in the climate space, about extraction, right? And like the fossil fuel industry's extraction of resources and the mining industry's extraction of resources. But I think it's important that we as journalists and as newsrooms also recognize the extraction that we do in communities, and how can we end that cycle so that we can actually build trust with our readers, and, you know, connect with new readers, especially readers of color and non-English speaking communities that need these climate stories too, and that need to have their stories told. And so I'm really excited about conversations like these that just leave space for us to look at what the sort of new frontier of climate storytelling looks like, that's more rooted in empathy, compassion, community, love. You know, like, it sounds corny, but it's so, so important when we're talking about people's lives, that we're approaching them with that care and that intention, given how delicate and urgent everything feels nowadays, with not just climate change, but just like ecological crises at large, and of course, like our health crisis as a result of all of these issues.
Yeah, that's so important. And seeing
Mm-hmm.
people in frontline communities as not just victims, but as solution makers, that they are building the solutions, that they have already been working to solve these problems, and
Exactly.
asking them
Yeah. I
questions
mean,
about
we are
that,
so
not
much more
just
than our
about
trauma,
what they've
and communities on the
experienced in the
ground, on the
trauma.
front lines. They often, like you said, they hold the answers, and they know what they need. And I think empowering their voices. You know, I always think back to the Flint water crisis and the way that, you know, the community was so poorly covered by the national media, and how much space was given to, you know, the state and the local governments, and how much the voices of the community were ignored when they knew what was going on. They knew it had to be done, but the media just
Mhm.
couldn't believe that, you know, poor Black folks knew what was going on. And so I think it's just a really perfect case study of what not to do, and of how to be better as these issues continue to arise.
Yeah, that actually brings me up, like, one of the parts of the report that was most interesting to me was this finding that if an article did mention communities of color, then they were more likely to be solutions focused. Which for me, that's like really beautiful and fascinating, and it shows how,
Mm-hmm.
again, like, if a journalist is approaching a story through that lens of equity and justice, if they're, you know, talking to the communities on the ground who are being most impacted, um, then hopefully those communities are speaking the truth about solutions. Communities of color have the solutions, and so we should listen to them. And so for me, if an article didn't mention the communities of color, then they are
That's
more likely to be just doom and gloom on the climate angle. So
Yeah,
that was
speaking
just
of
like
those
something that
findings,
was so
Thelma,
beautiful that
what
came out of
was
this
there, like one
report.
particular finding, and maybe this was it, like that really stood out to you, that left you a little surprised? Maybe it was a positive finding, maybe it was a discouraging finding, but I wonder if there was one that just jumped out at you, that left a mark, given how robust the report is.
That one I just talked about, and then the other one that we've been seeing this growth over the past couple of years of, um, if an article quotes a person, and again, that's the question of, like, will they actually quote a person? If they quote a
Yes.
person, then it is more likely that they're going to quote a woman. Um, which we also, this was the year where it's like finally that's like more likely that women are going to be the ones
Yeah,
talking
yeah, I think it's
about the climate
worth
solution
shouting out the
space.
fact
So that
that
was really cool as
when it comes
well.
to climate and
Yeah.
environment, women lead, and it's at this point like you can't ignore that. And so that to me feels like so in line with just when I look at the leadership of who's playing a role in climate and environment, women are the ones leading. And in newsrooms, like most reporters that I know personally, at least, are women. Like especially a lot of the younger journalists. Like it's really really encouraging to see. Like women want to talk to other women too. So I think it's just a really exciting finding, and I hope that more stories across outside of climate and environment are also following this pattern, because I would not think that that's the case outside of this space, unfortunately.
Yeah. Women are definitely leading. So, if someone's watching this live and they want to get started in the climate solutions storytelling space, or they want to like test the waters and like become a journalist,
Yeah, I mean,
do you have
shameless
any
plug. If
suggestions
you're
or
not familiar
recommendations for
with
them?
the Uproot, please do plug in. I'm one of the founding members there, and the folks running it are just doing exemplary work to create space not only for journalists of color but just environmental journalists at large. And I think it's a really invaluable space that was born in recent years. We have fellowships, in-person meetings. I'm also been getting more involved with the Society of Environmental Journalists, which has been making I think some pretty impressive efforts to try to improve on diversity and build in an equity lens into its organizing efforts. And so definitely encourage folks to plug in to SEJ as well. Really though, I think one thing that just you can't do enough of is find the reporters that you like and read their work, support their work, try to figure out what contribution you can add to this space. Where is there a region that maybe we need to hear more of, and how can you plug in? Is there a community that you represent, that you're a part of, that we need to hear more of? Try to figure out, as this is sort of like I think a popular saying now, like what is your superpower of sorts in the storytelling world? Whether that's like a beat, whether that's like a story type, like essay writing versus reporting, investigative versus like newsy hot takes. Like what could be your contribution that not only builds a more robust field, but that brings you joy and makes you happy, and really, really try to do your best to get good at it, and just reach out to people that you appreciate and respect. Like I get a lot of young journalists who send me emails or send me Instagram DMs, and I always try to make the time to respond, and I really appreciate that. I think it shows initiative, and it just shows that people are reading and engaging with climate journalism, which ultimately that's what you need to be doing to become a better journalist, is just read good work and get a sense of the kind of work you want to be doing.
Yes. And thank you for giving a shout out to Uproot Project. Huge fan. They're amazing. And thank you, Megan, for putting the website in the comments. Definitely follow Yesenia on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you so much for everyone engaging and watching today. And if you haven't seen the Climate Solutions Narrative Trends Report, check it out at the Solutions Project website. You'll be able to find it there, as well as previous reports, and our guide covering climate equitably are both on there as well. If not, we'll just wrap up this conversation. Yesenia, thank you
Of
so
course.
much for
Thank you
joining
so
me
much for inviting
today and
me.
for sharing
I'm
your
like feel so
experiences and
old
your
now trying
knowledge.
to do these new social media things. It's very fun. So thanks for keeping me hip. Bye,
Awesome. All right, and thank you
everybody.
everyone for joining, and we'll be in touch.